Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, all right. My name is Peter Friesen. I'm the Director of Education here at Historic St. Mary's City. Thank you for coming out to our second lecture of the 2023 season. Uh, Looks to be like an exciting one. I'll tell you a little bit more about our speaker later. Uh, but some housekeeping real quick. If you have cell phones, can you please put them on silent? That would be wonderful. We have a number of calendars and other published items out in the foyer, so you can check out some of our exciting events that we got coming up. It is May, which means June is next, which means that our largest fundraiser is coming up on June 24th, I believe, called Beer Fest. And if anybody is willing to help support the museum, we ask for your help in volunteering. We have a little flyer out there that you can scan the QR code, or you can contact our volunteer coordinator, Joy Lowe, and you can help support the museum through that action. Also, late June, we are celebrating and sharing our brand new exhibit called the Maryland Dove. You might have heard of it. Just got here in August. And so we're going to share that with the cities of Baltimore, Harvard de Grasse, and Cambridge this June. So if you have family, friends in those cities, you might want to let them know when we're going to be arriving. And will be free dockside exhibits at those locations. There's a beautiful flyer with all the tour dates on there. And then we will also be going to Crisfield later on in the summer or the fall in September. Also, you might have heard about a recent discovery. There's been a few of them happening a lot lately the past few years, thanks to our acting director here, Dr. Travis Parno, and his fabulous crew, who are doing amazing work and preserving our history of all peoples that came here by choice or by force. And so Tidewater Archaeology Weekend is when we celebrate that. And so you have that opportunity to come up and help out some of the archaeologists, check out what they're digging, go through the lab, see all the cool. What most people forget is archaeology is like what, 20% in the field and 80% in the lab and doing research. So you want to make sure you get the real archaeology, which is indoors, not outdoors. And then we have Shakespeare in the City in August. So you'll always want to check that out. But without further ado, our guest speaker is not a guest, I should say. She's in-house. Marley Putnam is our Historic St. Mary City Public Programs Coordinator. And prior to that, she was our waterfront site supervisor, which means she oversaw all the things that happened with the Maryland Dove and interpretation, school tours, and making sure all the staff there knew what to talk about. Marley came to us straight from graduate school. She completed her master's in history with a certificate in public history from Virginia Tech in 2019. And so we had to wait a few months before her graduate, before she actually started. Long wait for me. Marley has had a great deal of experience in her young career, though. Interning at the Wright Brother National Memorial, where she gave tours and helped develop curriculum standards for school tours based on North Carolina education standards. She also worked as first mate to several captains aboard the Movin' On, a 42-foot vessel that provides day and evening sailing charters for up to 6 guests. And also, she's had a lot of experience helping out at Festival Park in North Carolina on the Elizabeth II, where she had a great deal of experience about learning about 17th century vessels. So you can see why she was a good person to hire here for St. Mary's. She has been a great addition to our education team in helping develop new programs and revising other programs. Marley also became a mentor to some of our youth volunteers, one of them who I see here today, and showing them that women are just as capable of being sailors as men. This lecture, in a way, starts with one of the first official tasks I asked Marley to do when coming here. I asked if she could start a few days earlier so she could be at the official keel laying ceremony for our new Maryland Dove, which she was able to do. And I think that is a wonderful way for a new museum professional and a public historian in maritime to start off their brand new career. So without further ado, Marley Putnam, can you tell us more about Richard Orchard, master of the Dove?
Thank you, Peter. I was going to introduce myself. I've never had someone introduce me before, so it feels a little weird. But good evening. I'm still Marley Putnam. Like Peter said, I'm now the public programs coordinator. But when I started working here at Historic St. Mary City in May of 2019, I was the waterfront education supervisor. And that's really where this research topic started for me. So tonight I'm going to share with you a lot of research that I've done in the last 2 years, thereabouts, on a man named Richard Orchard. So if you've ever toured the Dove, you've probably heard his name. He was master of the 1634 Dove that came to Maryland, and we now know that he was an expert mariner who made at least 5 transatlantic crossings that I have found evidence of between England and the New World throughout the 1630s. So I really began researching this topic after spending my first 2 years here teaching the history of the Dove, talking about Richard Orchard to guests all of the time, and I had a little bit of spare time during COVID, so I started to think to myself, there has to be other records out there. Are there other records of Richard Orchard? Are there records about the other voyages he did? Because he had to have done other voyages. So cue a bunch of frantic keyword searches in academic bases and online archives, which eventually led to a ship's manifest, where I know he was the master of a ship called Alice, that we'll talk about a little bit later, and a lot of court documents. He spent a lot of time in court and was very successful, surprisingly. So I compiled all of these court documents and the ship's manifest, and I realized that I've got records of these 5 transatlantic crossings. I've got all this new information, including demographic information, like his age and where he's from. And all of those records revealed a lot of his opinions on matters that were going on within Virginia and Maryland, these 2 new Chesapeake colonies. So I had all this information. I took it to Jeremy and the other waterfront staff and just kind of got really excited. And I was like, what do I do with all of this? So I sat down after I had all of this and I started to think, why is this important? How am I going to make this important? Not only to Historic St. Mary City, but to public historians and to maritime historians, these academic fields at large. So public history, that was an easy one to answer, and it's part of the reason we built a new Maryland Dove last year, or over the last 3 years. So originally, the original Maryland Dove was built in 1978, and back then people were more interested in the tobacco trade at large, but in the last 40 years, we've seen this shift in visitor interest. It's no longer on this macro scale of the tobacco trade as an industry. Most of our visitors are more interested in the individual stories, what it was like for people that were passengers aboard these ships, crew members, or in this case, captains or masters. So these individual stories, these experiences, they start to become an integral part of our interpretation. Which brings me to why this is important to our museum. So having a story for Richard Orchard outside of this 2-year relationship we already knew about with the Calverts and the investors in Maryland at the very beginning of its history as an English colony, this really will allow museum visitors to build connections, create new perspectives that we couldn't provide before on how shipboard societies functioned during this time period. And how important mariners like Richard Orchard and his crew were to ensuring the success of English colonies. Because really these men, they weren't just bringing ships across the ocean, they were driving English exploration, trade, economics, all facets of industry and society for the English as far as expanding. And then I thought about, why is this important to maritime historians? And really, what I'm trying to do here, this is just the very first step in this research, but eventually I think it will fill a gap in historiography. So maritime history at large tends to also have a macro scale, and that's because there's not a lot of primary sources on the individuals that were involved in these industries. So instead of looking at big timelines, looking at large trends, we can start to create microhistories and just kind of aid this field in a way that it's been lacking over the last several decades or so. But with all of that being said, I will begin Richard Orchard's story in an attempt to convey to you how this unlanded middleman. I took that phrase from an article, but I really like it. It fits him very well. But how him and many mariners like him asserted his agency and gained success not only in England, but and in the colonies on both sides of the Atlantic without actually really having to be there for, or be in either of those places for any length of time. So our story starts in the fall of 1633, when the Calverts and their fellow investors in the Maryland colony hire Richard Orchard to be the master of a 40-ton pinnace named Dove to cross the Atlantic and serve as Maryland's first intercoastal trading vessel. You can see the silhouette up here. The Dove was the smaller of the two. So, not an easy task to take a ship that small across the entire Atlantic Ocean, which gives you your first inkling that he may have been experienced in what he does. On November 22nd, 1633, Richard Orchard and Dove depart England in the company of the much larger Ark, which carried the passengers, and this began a 3.5-month journey across the Atlantic, up the Chesapeake, and then lastly into what is now the St. Mary's River, where Maryland becomes established at the end of March 1634. Orchard's time aboard Dove ends in November of 1634, when he and his crew abandon her in Point Comfort, Virginia. So they abandon her in Point Comfort, Virginia in November of 1634 because they are now on month 13 of a 12-month contract. And when Leonard Calvert and his investors refused to pay Richard and his crew their extra month's wages, they just leave. They abandon the Dove and they leave for England aboard other vessels. They end up back in England. They sue the Calverts and the other investors in the two ships, suing them in Admiralty Court, and they win. So the court records that are produced from this case, which I'll talk about first, reveal that Orchard may very well have been the cause of this longer anticipated voyage. But nonetheless, he did win, and Admiralty Court supported mariners like him because of his experience and the influence he had on English society. So there's 3 examples that are given by Calvert in these court documents as to why Orchard was the cause of this extra month on a 12-month contract. So the first example we're going to talk about involves the meeting of the Ark and Dove in Barbados in January of 1633, after being separated in a storm 6 weeks prior. So they were separated 2 or 3 days into the journey from England to begin with, separated for 6 weeks. Now they're meeting in Barbados. So before departing England, they knew this was a possibility, and they had made an agreement that if the 2 ships had become separated, that they would meet in St. Christopher's in the Lower Antilles. I think today it's called St. Kitts. So it was agreed upon that they would meet there if they were separated, and therefore, according to Calvert, Orchard is never supposed to be in Barbados to begin with. And the reality for that happening, according to Calvert, and this is a quote from him, is that the said Richard Orchard left and forsook the said ship the Ark and went with the pinnace Dove onto the Barbados on purpose to accommodate and follow his own occasions, to seek or look after the recovery of a debt or debts which were due unto him. So if this is true, that already proves that Orchard has done transatlantic crossings before, so that's really important to note. I haven't found record of any of those voyages yet, but if he does have that debt that's due in Barbados, he had to have been there before, so he knows his route to get across the Atlantic. He's experienced in what he does. And although it may be true, the relevancy of this claim on Calvert's part is questionable in my mind, and I thought about this and came up with several reasons why. So one is the practical advantage you have in landing at Barbados when coming from England to begin with. So you can see Barbados at the right and at the bottom of the islands in the Lower Antilles. For any sailors out there, Barbados is the most windward island. So you're following the trade winds coming from England. Barbados is the easiest island to stop at, and you can basically make your way and ping-pong your way north through all of these islands to make port as you need to from there. So it makes sense that Orchard would stop there, whether or not he had a debt to collect. And this is a little bit of extraneous information, But I'll also note that knowing that the Ark had been in Barbados for several weeks before Dove's arrival, one would assume that if Orchard had skipped Barbados and gone straight to St. Christopher's, he would have had to wait there for the Ark to arrive anyway. And Father Andrew White, who was the Jesuit priest aboard the Ark, he left a very detailed narrative that we use very heavily in our interpretive day-to-day museum operations. He fails to describe anything having to do with Orchard being somewhere he's not supposed to be by being in Barbados. He merely states that the two ships meet in Barbados after being separated, and that he was surprised because those aboard the Ark had basically considered the Dove lost in the storm for good when they were separated a month and a half earlier. So, I have no doubt Orchard would go against the initial agreement for his own gain, and I think that for a lot of reasons, but in the context of these court documents and this one voyage, this is not the only time this occurs. It's only a month later, while both ships are en route to St. Christopher's, that Orchard again disappears from the Ark's presence for a period of time and for an unspecified reason. So this brings us to Calvert's second example of why this is all Richard Orchard's fault. So Calvert's testimony states that, you can see it up here, but I'll read it in case it's too small for people in the back. The said Orchard did willfully and of his own accord forsake and leave the said ship the Ark, and linger and stay behind with the pinnace the Dove at Montserrat and Nevis by the space of 10, 5, 4, 3, or 2 days, and the said ship or pinnace the Dove was in that time chased and in danger to have been taken by a Spanish frigate. So there's a lot of speculation that can be made about this statement on Calvert's part, based in historical context and on primary source material. So the first thing I observed when I read Calvert's words is the lack of credibility caused by not having a better idea of how long the Dove actually was out of sight of the Ark. Because 2 to 10 days is a pretty large span of time. That's a huge margin of error. And there's also no mention of this in Father Andrew White's narrative. So Father Andrew White never talks about the Dove being gone between Barbados and St. Christopher's, which also hurts Calvert's credibility. However, Father Andrew White does write thoroughly about his fears of the Spanish and the fears of the Spanish aboard, or for everybody aboard the Ark. And this is a fear that the English had been exhibiting for about 50 years at this point, since the fight with the Spanish Armada in the 1580s. So Dove could have been chased by Spanish frigates, or Orchard could have used that as an excuse to disguise his own agenda. We don't know. But if he was using this as a disguise, he's successfully feeding off the fears of others he knew existed. Either way, he's showing his expertise as a mariner, because he's either, one, safely maneuvered away from Spanish frigates with a ship that is not a very maneuverable or efficient sailor, or he basically just understood the social dynamics of the English seafaring community and basically uses this to his advantage. Now, with debts owed and Spanish frigates be damned, Ark and Dove do successfully make it to St. Mary's River at the end of March 1634. Maryland begins its life as a new colony, and it shortly begins to flourish. By August, it's flourishing so much that there's a surplus of corn that's been produced, and that's evidence of this flourishing economy. Leonard Calvert, knowing what to do with this corn, he writes to John Winthrop, who is the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it's decided that Orchard is going to transfer this corn to Boston, trade it for salt cod and other commodities. So this is supposed to be a quick trip. It takes about 7 or 8 weeks typically. In theory, it should take 7 or 8 weeks. But this trip ends up taking almost 4 months. And this is Calvert's final reason for Orchard being the cause of this overextended contract. The reason it took so long to get to Boston and back is never cited by Orchard or speculated by Calvert in the court documents. But we do have a journal entry from Governor Winthrop from October of that year. And he talks about how the Dove crew creates a lot of trouble and definitely overstays their welcome. So this is a picture of Winthrop, and this is a picture of his journal. But in October, in his entry, he writes, "Some of our people, being aboard the bark of Maryland, the sailors did revile them, calling them holy brethren, the members, etc., and withal did curse and swear most horribly, and use threatening speeches against us." So the crew is subsequently apprehended, interviewed on shore, and then a letter is written to Richard Orchard stating that in regard such disorders are committed aboard your ship, it is your duty to inquire out the offenders and punish them, and withal to desire him to bring no more such disordered persons among us. So basically with that, Dove and her crew are essentially kicked out of Boston, and they're not supposed to return. So Orchard's obviously fostering some bad relationships here. But it's still an important situation to analyze because it proves the amount of power men in positions like Richard Orchard's held, not only on board ships, but on land as well. Although the crew had legal procedures taken against them, ultimately it was put in Richard Orchard's hands. He was given the power to decide who was guilty, what extent they were guilty to, and how and when they should be punished. So the mysteriously extended period of time spent in Boston only fuels Leonard Calvert's argument that it's Orchard's fault this is all happening, and that the Dove's voyages are taking way longer than specified in this initial contract. Like the instances in Barbados and off of Martinique and Nevis, Calvert uses the same language. He insists that the said Richard Orchard has neglected his time, he's followed his own pleasures, he's followed his own occasions. This has happened in Barbados, off of Martinique and Nevis, and on the voyage from Maryland to Massachusetts Bay in New England. So the voyage from Massachusetts Bay also takes longer than it should have, because not only does Richard Orchard take his time in Boston, he ignores the plan that was set by Calvert to come back to St. Mary's, and instead travels further and makes port in Point Comfort, Virginia. So Calvert and one of the investors in the Maryland colony, Jeremy Hawley, they happen to be in Point Comfort. We don't know if Orchard knew this or not, but they come aboard, and that's when this debate over extra wages starts to take place. Calvert and Hawley approach Richard Orchard, and they make it clear that they intend to have Orchard transport them back to St. Mary City in what they call a mutinous and insolent manner. Orchard refuses to let himself, his crew, or the Dove budge until these wages had been satisfied. Like I mentioned earlier, Orchard and his crew, they don't come to an agreement with Calvert and Jeremy Hawley. They end up abandoning the Dove in Point Comfort, Virginia. They go back to England, they start this case in Admiralty Court, and they win those extra wages and their court case. So I can see where Calvert's argument is obviously valid, but it's not enough to convince Admiralty Court to take his side. The fact that Orchard wins this case and his extra wages is important because it shows that the nobility, like the Calverts, and wealthy investors like Jeremy Hawley and others didn't have an inherent upper hand in Admiralty Court matters. Shipmasters like Orchard, they're, like I keep saying, they're crucial to English trade, to economics, exploration. Really, the Admiralty Court recognizes this fact, and they support the mariners accordingly. Many historians have done work that supports this idea as well. So George F. Steckley is one of these historians that I read a lot of his work. He has studied Admiralty Court records from the 17th century, and he concluded that in the 17th century, 60,000 mariners or more could reasonably expect to win their wages at Admiralty Court in situations like this. R.J. Blakemore is another historian that basically supports these same ideas. But in his case, he's studying both Admiralty Court and Hull Trinity House, which basically serves the same function as the Admiralty Court. And he finds that low-ranking seafarers make up the considerable majority of plaintiffs, and in a large number of these cases they win, so in far more than half. So this isn't the only way that ship's masters in the 17th century are asserting their agency and their authority. They are also asserting their authority through a process called hypothecation, which Richard Orchard, in my opinion, does aboard during his time aboard Dove. So In the process of hypothecation, contracts are made between a ship's owner and a ship's master that typically give the said master the right to use the ship and any of its contents as collateral. If a loan is needed to be secured, if you need funds for wages, if provisions need to be attained and you need funds for that. And it's a crucial option to have while you're underway, because that's a 3,000-mile journey to the English colonies. And both common law and admiralty court in England had legal statutes that made these rights valid for masters to hypothecate. And I don't have proof that Richard Orchard and the investors and Calvert, when they made their initial contract, wrote up anything about hypothecation, but I think he indirectly invokes his right to hypothecate during Dove's brief stay in Point Comfort, Virginia in November of 1634. So after disobeying the orders of the ship's investors to bring the pinnace back to Maryland after trading in Boston and instead of coming back to St. Mary's, coming to Point Comfort, Orchard and several of his crew, they go ashore, they leave the ship for a couple of days, they leave it unattended, and this happens during a storm. So this compromises the vessel's integrity, right? Calvert and his fellow investor, Jeremy Hawley, are then joined aboard Dove afterwards, once the storm passes, by Orchard and his crew. And that's where those tensions over the unpaid wages and hypothecation began. So having been in the New World longer than originally agreed and going unpaid, Orchard claims that he's going to keep possession of the said pinnace for his wages. In Calvert's account, this is done in an unjustified manner, claiming that when coming aboard the said Orchard with his company, aforesaid, and divers others did riotously enter into the said pinnace and carry themselves in a very mutinous and braving manner. Calvert uses the word mutinous a lot to describe these people. But while we don't have a record of any contract for hypothecation being made between Orchard and the Dove investors, the actions of Orchard's in Point Comfort lead me to believe that in the very least he's familiar with this process and the advantage that it serves people like him in his position. And he's upfront in these court documents about his actions. He's upfront about why he believes they're justified, and the fact that he wins this case and he's paid these extra wages is testament to the agency that he could exhibit in this time period. The respect that could be afforded to him and others like him in Admiralty Court, and in a way, how much people like him can get away with. So we also know from the ship's manifest I mentioned at the very beginning that Orchard suing the Calverts and the investors in 1635 doesn't tarnish his reputation in the slightest. This court case is over by April of 1635, and only 3 months later, we find Orchard departing England in a ship by the name of Alice, having been contracted to transport 32 passengers across the Atlantic Ocean to the Virginia colony. So this is the only source I have for this voyage at all, but there's still a lot that we can glean from it. It's important in the creation of Richard Orchard's microhistory because it reveals the consistency of his workload. He's not struggling to find his next job. He only stayed in England for a short time between abandoning Dove and winning his court case. So if he leaves Point Comfort in November of 1635. Let's say he's back in England by December, early January. So this court case starts as soon as he gets back, sometime at the end of January, early February. Ends in April, he's gone in July. That means that's a 7-month period that he's gone, or that he's in England at the most. 3 months of that being him tied in with this court case itself. So this transatlantic voyage with Alice is the third of 5 that I have found evidence of between 1633 and 1638. So he brings Dove over, goes back to England, now he's back aboard Alice. And in analyzing the passenger manifest for Alice, we can reveal the influence of shipmasters when put into the context of population numbers of a young Virginia colony. So I took a little bit of a different approach here, took a little bit of a statistics analysis rather than a historical one. And I use the secondary sources of Professor Allison Games, a maritime historian from Georgetown University, for this. So in 1634, Virginia has just under 5,000 English colonists. And in 1635, according to Games, 2,009 people arrived from London alone to Virginia. And she believes that about the same amount of people came from ships from England, but different ports, so outside of London itself. So that's about 4,000 people. In 1635, that could have almost doubled Virginia's population. Could have had 1,800 people not died that same year in Virginia. And this is reported by Samuel Maverick, who was a colonist who lived in Virginia at the time. He does later move to Massachusetts and lives in the colony under John Winthrop. So this means that in 1635, Virginia goes from having an approximate population of 5,000 to about 7,000. And Orchard's voyage to Virginia in this year only brings 32 new colonists, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you break it down, statistically, that's about 1.6% of the new survived colonist arrivals in that year. And by 1649, as cited by the primary source, A Perfect Description of Virginia, written in that time period, it was estimated that there was about 15,000 English colonists in Virginia, and that over 30 ships were visiting every year, and those ships employed approximately 7 to 1,000 mariners. So contextualizing these individual stories, and stories like Orchard's, in this way provides a new perspective when thinking about the importance of ships and the importance of the men who ran them. Without these men, this young and struggling colony wouldn't have been able to survive. And the same is true for Maryland and all of the English colonies, really. When putting stories like Orchard's into these contexts, we also start to see how mariners fit into the social dynamics of these growing English colonies as well. So the ratio of mariners to Virginia colonists throughout the 17th century is high enough to make mariners a real presence, especially because settlement patterns and trade patterns and methods are bringing settlers into frequent contact with these mariners. Not only do men like Orchard bring passengers to the New World, they're interacting with them heavily and for long periods of time while they're here. And there's many examples of this mariner-colonist relationship that are described in a general sense. The ones I can think of offhand are, ships' captains are commonly staying with wealthy Virginia merchants and officials. Seamen are either staying on the ship, or it's also common for them to stay in colonist homes with them. And when colonists are loading shallops with tobacco or ship's boats to be rowed and transferred to the larger ships that would take that tobacco back to England, they're not doing this by themselves. Most of the time, they're waiting for mariners to arrive from these ships to help facilitate this lading and rowing process. So April Hatfield is a maritime historian, and her writings back up these ideas, and I also like to use primary source materials to back up these ideas too. So this is Edward Rhodes's log. He's a little bit after Richard Orchard's time, 1672, 1673, but he actually visited St. Mary City and talks about all of these examples I just mentioned. So according to Edward Rhodes, he was aboard a ship called Constant Friendship. He arrived in St. Mary City on April 2nd and sent shallops abroad for ye remainder of our lading, which we had to take in. So that shows that they're taking part in this lading process, this loading process of hogsheads onto the shallops themselves. So they stay in St. Mary City until April 27th. That's when Constant Friendship departs the St. Mary's River. And Rhodes also notes a few months prior to this, they were also in St. Mary's City on a different excursion. And he talks about the master going ashore to begin the process of offloading any cargo they had, and he doesn't return for multiple nights, having slept elsewhere ashore. So Rhodes' log is really cool because it reveals how long sailors are able to interact with colonists at any one port. St. Mary City never has a very large population. Land grants in exchange for colonist transport are used to encourage population growth until 1681, so about 10 years after Edward Rhodes's visit. This bolsters the idea that many historians have regarding the depth of colonial mariner relationships. So we have no evidence of any ship's logs being written by Richard Orchard, but I think we can use him as a specific case in relationships like this taking place. We see it through the court documents that pertain to his work aboard the Dove, and then we see it again 2 years later in 1637 in more court records with his next transatlantic voyage aboard Bonnie Bess. So after Orchard's trip across the Atlantic aboard Alice, I lose track of him for roughly 2 years. But then in 1637, he begins to pop back up in several Admiralty court cases pertaining to colonial affairs that all started in Jamestown's Quarter Court. But the one I'm going to focus on takes place in July of 1637, when Orchard and 9 other sailors and merchants sue a man named Joseph Saunders. So they're suing Joseph Saunders over unpaid wages and the restitution of damaged goods aboard a ship that he owned called Flower de Luce. In previous years, Flower de Luce had brought passengers to Virginia and tobacco back to England. It had sailed to Virginia in the company of a smaller ship called Bonnie Bess. It was a 50-ton ship. We know this through a bill of sale, so it's just a little bit bigger than the Dove. And it had ran aground after arriving in the New World, suffering a lot of major damage. And then Bonnie Bess ends up being sold to Richard Orchard shortly after it suffers all of this damage, and none of it is ever reported to Richard Orchard. So while his fellow plaintiffs had gone unpaid, Orchard has been sold a ship that's in dire need of repair. Saunders actually originally offered this vessel to Leonard Calvert, and he refused. So you see a lot of crossover between Orchard and Leonard Calvert's interactions during this decade. It's pretty neat. But when the ship, now in Orchard's ownership, is blown aground again in another storm and begins taking on water at a dangerous rate, Orchard is disposed to revoke his bargain until the governor ordered him to keep it. So the governor of Virginia basically said, no, you have to keep this vessel. This is interesting given Orchard and Calvert's past, because you see the starts of more tensions rising, and by the end of this presentation, you'll see that the tension is definitely there for a very long time. But things do pan out, and they work in the favor of Richard Orchard and all of his fellow plaintiffs. Bonnie Bess is pulled back into deeper waters by a larger ship called the America, and both of them sail for England in each other's company and successfully arrive in the summer of 1638. So we know Orchard indeed brought his new ship back to England because this part of his journey is explicitly mentioned in 2 crew testimonies. So there was a man named William King who was the boatswain aboard the America. He reported that upon both of the ships returning to England, Bonnie Bess is forced by contrary winds to put into the Isle of Wight, and once they get to the Isle of Wight, Orchard puts beer aboard that vessel. William Cropp was another man. He was employed as Orchard's first mate for this voyage, and he testifies that Orchard had paid the wages that were due to his crew in a timely manner. And Cropp also reveals in his Quarter Court deposition that Bonnie Bess had been loaded with tobacco before making its return voyage to England, with Orchard as both master and owner this time. So at this point in his career, we now have evidence of Orchard conducting trade on both transatlantic and local or intercoastal scales. He's bringing passengers to the New World, and he's actively participating in the tobacco trade by doing these transatlantic voyages. Although my research is lacking in descriptions of specific time periods that Orchard is spending in these locations, and I'm comparing this to say, Edward Rhodes's log, which is very, very detailed. Chances are he spent a considerable amount of time interacting with Virginia and Maryland residents alike. And this part of this story connects him to a larger world outside of the Dove voyage and the colonization of Maryland that we focus on here at HSMC. And for me, it makes him more real. You start to realize how influential he was and how well traveled he was between two new, lowly populated Chesapeake colonies, two pretty small communities compared to a lot of our communities today. And I like the fact that we know that he purchased Bonnie Bess, because it tells us that he's good enough at what he does to become fairly wealthy, at least wealthy enough to buy a 50-ton vessel, bigger than the Dove that the Calverts had bought. And we don't have records of every colonist he interacted with, but we do know that he certainly did find time to network and build relationships, both good and bad, with some of our favorite colonial Chesapeake characters. And we see this in an Admiralty court case taking place between 1639 and 40, where he is interviewed as a witness in a case started by William Claiborne, where he sues the joint stock company of which he had been a partner on Kent Island. So this joint stock company is called Clawberry and Company. It's a stock trading commission whose essential headquarters are on Kent Island, which in the early 17th century belongs to Virginia. Claiborne and Clawberry, or Clawberry and Company and Claiborne had a constant feud with the Calvert family since the establishment of Maryland in the early 1630s. The Maryland Charter states that the northern limit for this new colony would be unto that part of the Bay of Delaware on the north, which lieth under the 40th degree of north latitude from the equinoctial. So basically everything south of the 40-degree latitude line is going to be Maryland now. Because Kent Island falls south of this latitude mark at 38.9 degrees, it's close, but it's still south, the Calverts consider it to be under the jurisdiction of their new colony, and, of course, they're going to pursue it accordingly. So Claiborne and his joint stock company, they fight hard against the Calvert push for Kent Island, but it doesn't work. And they're legally defeated when Lord Baltimore sues Claiborne specifically in 1638. So the verdict of this suit is that Claiborne has no legal claim to Kent Island, and that it does in fact fall within the bounds of the Maryland colony. By the end of this year, Claiborne has suffered a lot of defeats and a lot of loss. He's seen his Maryland property confiscated. His commission as an agent for the joint stock company is withdrawn, and his claims to ownership of Kent Island are denied by the London government as well. So this doesn't deter him. Instead, he goes on the offensive, and he does this from England, and he files 2 suits in 1640. Neither of them end in his favor either, but one of them gives me my last mention of Richard Orchard that I've been able to find thus far, and reveals, in my opinion, the coolest information about him. So Claiborne files this suit in Maryland, and he hopes that he can regain the property and the goods he had lost to Lord Baltimore in 1638. Ends up being a fruitless effort. And at the same time in Virginia, he sues Clawberry and Company for damages out of the actions of a man named Captain Evelyn. So Captain Evelyn was George Evelyn. He had bought shares in the joint stock company around the time that Claiborne had been kicked out. So Claiborne sees this as, him basically being replaced. And he's also not happy because Evelyn has been known to conduct friendly relations with the Calverts. So in Claiborne's mind, he's concerned that Evelyn is going to encourage and support the Maryland possession of Kent Island. And his concerns are valid. Governor Calvert had actually appointed Evelyn at one point the commander of Kent Island. So many of the men who testified in this court case, though, they show clear and strong support for Claiborne. And Richard Orchard ends up being one of these men. So this is the summary of Orchard's testimony in the Claiborne versus Clawberry and Company case. Richard Orchard of Wapping, Middlesex, sailor aged 40. He has lived in Maryland and Virginia for 2 years and has often seen the patent granted to Lord Baltimore for the province of Maryland. The Isle of Kent, or Isle of Contentment, of Virginia is north of the 40-degree line, and the greater part is therefore outside the bounds of Maryland. So the first time I read this information, I was absolutely ecstatic. I made Peter buy the book that I found it in online. Well, I asked politely. What excited me most is that we now had a record of his age. He's 40 years old in 1639 or 40 at the time of this court case. And this is really cool because a question we get all the time aboard Maryland Dove from visitors is, how old were sailors during this time period? And that's a super hard question to answer. We don't have primary sources that talk a lot about that. People weren't writing down their ages on their specific voyages and what their roles were. And it wasn't uncommon in this time period for mariners or colonists alike to not know their exact age. Oh, not yet. If court records state that Orchard was 40 in 1639 or 40, that's really nice because we can do simple math, and we put him at 34 or 35 during his voyages as Master of the Dove in 1633 and 34. So this is just another way to personalize him and bring him to life for our museum visitors. It's valuable to maritime historians because it's at least a small example of the proof of how quickly a mariner can move up the ranks and become well established in their career. The evidence presented that he had lived in the colonies for 2 years is significant when we put it in the chronological context of his Bonnie Bess voyage. If we know Bonnie Bess arrives in England with Orchard as master in the summer of 1638, then we know that he very quickly turned around, made another transatlantic voyage, and came back to the Chesapeake Bay, where he lived for 2 years before being interviewed for the Claiborne case. So Orchard makes mention that he has often seen the patent for the Maryland colony. I don't think this is true, but whether it's true or not at this point is impossible for me to prove. We may find documents in the future that could confirm or deny it. But why does he make this claim? I think he says he has seen the patent in an attempt to gain himself credibility so that his next statement can be believed by court officials. And that next claim was that Kent Island cannot be considered part of the Maryland colony because it lies north of the 40-degree latitude line, thus out of the boundary specified by the 1632 Maryland Charter. Kent Island is definitely not north of the 40-degree latitude mark, as Orchard claims. In fact, it's specifically just a little bit south of that at 38.9373 degrees. And St. Mary City, just for reference, is just a little bit further south. We're at 38.1872 degrees. So knowing this, the next question I ask is, did Orchard lie on the court record? And if he lied on the court record, why? Why would he do that? I don't think he made a genuine mistake and believed himself that Kent Island was at a latitude north of 40 degrees. If he made at least 5 transatlantic crossings up to this point, and he spent a handful of years navigating up and down the Chesapeake Bay successfully, I don't think he's going to make a mistake that large. And this map is a good visual of that. So we're somewhere in here, and Kent Island is right here, and the 40-degree line is way up here. That's a lot of land and water to forget about. While there's no concrete way of knowing how accurate the average mariner is, as far as navigational practices in the 17th century, there are sources that tend to agree that navigators can easily tell time within a quarter of an hour and find a precise location with a margin of error within a few miles. That's way more than a few miles. And this margin of error cited by Orchard would not allow for this margin of error cited by historians of only a few miles doesn't allow for a mistake as large as the one that Orchard is citing about Kent Island in these court documents. Overall, Orchard's deposition is an incredible primary source. It adds a great deal to his microhistory. It provides us with demographic information about himself, where he's from, how old he is, shows the agency he has in 2 English colonies. He's, at this point, established a reputation for himself within the Chesapeake Bay community at large. He's known as a respected sailor. He's asked for navigational input in important legal matters. And the misinformation he provides is revealing of those tensions that have existed between him and those who established the Maryland colony. So this has been going on for 5 years at this point. The notion is backed by primary sources from 5 and 6 years previous, the Dove voyages and its ensuing court case. And unfortunately, this is where I lose track of Richard Orchard, which leaves future opportunities to add to this story. And basically, to conclude, all in all, being able to lengthen our narrative of Richard Orchard's life by half a decade, it's obviously been a rewarding journey for me, but it's one that I hope will benefit historic St. Mary City and fit into a rising trend in public and maritime history at large. There's still a lot of work to do. This is basically phase 1 of something I hope will be really cool someday. And microhistory is a rising trend. When we think of microhistory, we consider it as exploring the everyday life of an ordinary person, or a non-elite individual or small group, and the goal of it is to examine the extent and the limits upon the agency of these people. And with the shift in visitor interest in regards to Maryland Dove over the last 40 years, this microhistory can't come at a better time. It leaves enough mystery that visitors can create their own narrative, but gives us enough fact that we can be inspired by a little imagination and still have a historical chronology to go with it, which is really nice for what we do. I think this microhistory, in the process of future research, is going to allow us to make connections, and for visitors to make connections to their own experiences. That's a goal that public historians have in general. And I think it's striving at what creators of microhistory want to achieve. So with that, I think I'll conclude my presentation, and I think we've got some time to take some questions and comments, and thank you guys for coming. Kent.
Yeah. I got you. A number of years ago, I had the pleasure of sailing across the Atlantic, and I navigated shit. They did it with modern instruments. I took noon sights all the way across with a late 17th century Davis instead. And I'll send you that. I plotted that in the chart.
Mm-hmm.
You can judge what kind of error is in those methods. But just think about what Orchard was saying and what kind of error and latitude he might have. Just look at it, be fun. You did say what happened to the dove. And you could tell us that story.
Oh, yeah.
Her fate was very similar to the old dove.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. So we actually do have a cross staff and a Davis back staff on site. The cross staff I'm fairly good with. The back staff I've never really gotten the hang of. But they can be fairly accurate tools to use, especially if it's someone like Will Gates using it. So 1634 Dove. Like I said, she gets abandoned in Point Comfort, Virginia. The investors in Calvert do find a crew to bring her back to St. Mary's. They try to send her back to England in August of 1635, full of beaver fur and timber to make a profit from in England. However, she leaves the St. Mary's River and she's never seen again. And knowing that she was abandoned during storms, knowing how bad ship's worms are in the Chesapeake Bay, one can only assume that she probably was lost at sea and sank at some point during this voyage. Whether it was in the Potomac, Chesapeake Bay, or out in the Atlantic, we don't know. And then 1978 Dove, she's not lost. She's at Dennis Point Marina in Drayton. And we haven't decided exactly what we're going to do. There's a lot of ideas about options for turning her or parts of her into exhibits, but right now she's on the hard at Dennis Point, basically shrink wrapped to stay preserved for now, until we come up with the the best viable option for the museum and the community with what to do with it.
I got hung up on a month, fighting 3 months for a month wages. Don't turn that into today's dollars, but where is that in the pay scale of the day? Are they like, way up high? Are they like the average Joe in terms of what kind of pay was he getting compared to a landowner, for example?
Oh, to like a plantation owner? That's a hard question to answer. So Orchard is definitely getting paid the most out of his crew. I do know the court documents talk about what the payment was specifically, but that escapes my mind right now. I can't remember exactly what that was. And then equating what they were getting back then to modern currency and that's like a whole different can of worms.
That's why I was trying to get comparison to.
Right. Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. But I do know he's making good enough money to buy a 50-ton vessel a couple years later. So he's making considerable amounts of money if he's able to do that.
Well, masters back in that day, they operated quite a bit different than masters do now, and they had a lot of latitude, so to speak, to find other ways to make money by taking on cargoes, and they would work on percentages. So the masters would usually contract with various merchants, and then with his crew, the master would or the trading company or whatever it was would have a separate contract with the crew, so that nothing was really standardized. You tend to think of today, how wages are handled today in the shipping industry. I'm a professional mariner, so I have a little bit of background in this, but now there's a fairly standardized agreement called shipping articles, which makes it very easy to understand today. Back then it was Indian territory and everybody cut their own deal.
Yep, and I think Orchard's side quest to Barbados to collect a debt is a perfect example of that too.
Make one other comment about the latitude issue, and the latitude issue is that's whoever made the comment about the cross path, that's valid while at sea, but when you're on shore, which they could have done from Kent Island, you can very precisely figure the latitude by making pretty simple observations of the sun with some very crude instruments, and not be each latitude, if you're going north and south, is 60 nautical miles. So each degree of latitude, you can simply subtract the number that the two numbers that you were using, 40 degrees and whatever the other number was. And if you had it in decimal form, you can come up and multiply that by 60, and you'll figure out how big his error in miles was. And a quick calculation in my head, it was over 60 miles.
Yep.
I mean, that's a pretty ridiculous error even in those times.
Exactly. Yep.
They could figure it out very precisely, I'm sure.
How common or uncommon would it have been for a ship master to have been its owner?
It's less common than some people would think, and that's why we don't know what if the Dove of 1634 did make it back to England. Part of the reason we can't know that is having different masters and owners. Ships change ownership all the time, so it would have been very likely if she had made it back successfully, she'd immediately change owners. That owner would have changed the name of the ship, would have employed another master, and she would have gone on another voyage. That's what I have found is the most common circumstance.
I'm going to offer one more comment in defense of Richard Orchard. Well, the size of these two vessels, the Ark and the Dove, is pretty considerable difference. And because of that, and the waterline length and the limits of how fast a boat can go, on a voyage that long, storm or no storm, unless the Ark was sailing in circles to
Yep.
it would have outpaced them by weeks, coming across the ocean just based on their relative speeds.
Yep. Yeah, and even Father Andrew White notes how inefficient a sailor the Dove was. I can't remember the exact phrase he uses. Do you remember, Jeremy?
Not the exact phrase.
A dull sailor. That's what it was. Yeah.
And the Ark did have to slow down for the Dove to catch up when they were racing the Dragon out of the channel.
Yep.
Is there any record of his personal life? I mean, it sounds like you traveled so much you've never married or had children.
I wish. Yeah, people ask me all the time, like when I was thinking about pictures for the PowerPoint, I had a lot of people come up and say, well, why don't you just find a portrait of Richard Orchard? I'm like, if it was only that easy. But no, and I was a little restricted in my research, only being able to use online databases and what, libraries and archives had digitized back in England. So that's where there's a lot of room for growth here. Someone could take a trip to England and look through archives and documents that have never been digitized or scanned. Yeah, so cough, cough, education department.
You could probably send Marley. I do know for a fact the Admiralty Court records have not been digitized.
They have
so,
not.
It will work. It's been a few years there.
Come back with an accent. No, I'm just kidding.
I saw Wapping, Middlesex there. Would birth records and whatnot be something like that?
That's a great idea.
They're possibly digitized.
Depends on the parish you was born
it's
in.
in the parish,
Yeah.
the Bible. There's a lot of variables there. And so your best choice is going there.
Yeah.
You want to go along with it?
You don't, all of us historians are archaeologists.
Speak at all to the political context between Maryland and Virginia. It's interesting to see him start very much with the Catholic American colonists and then gradually more and more side with the Virginia colony. Do you know anything else about his feelings in that?
I have nothing on Richard Orchard's religious beliefs, but from what I see in documents and what I glean about his personality, I don't think he cares as much about the religious aspect. This is all just a moneymaker for him. And there are tensions, like you said, when Maryland begins as a colony, Father Andrew White writes about the fears they have of the Virginians for religious and political reasons. Some of the Virginians felt like the area north of the Potomac needed to stay Virginia. They felt like their land was being taken. And then there was religious Catholic versus Protestant tension there as well. But for Richard Orchard, and I think for a lot of mariners, religion didn't play a huge part. This was just a money-making machine.
When he successfully sued in Admiralty Court, what was the, verdict? What did he actually get in return?
So when he sues the Dove investors, he gets the extra month's wages. That's the only tangible thing he gets out of it. When he sues Joseph Saunders, I do think he gets paid for the restitution of the damage to Bonnie Bess. And then because he was just a witness in the Claiborne case, he didn't get anything out of that.
What's the monetary?
Yep.
One other thing to note with this, to tie in with what Marley's thesis and how much political influence or capital that Masters had at this time. There's another case later on in the 17th century of a woman who was executed on board a ship for witchcraft, and there was a trial brought against the owner of the ship and the master of the ship, and the owner of the ship was able to successfully defend himself, saying, "I just own the ship. I'm not in charge. The master is the one who actually did the execution." So again, in that society, it goes back to show the difference between being an owner and a master of a ship. They're very distinct legal things.
Okie doke. I think we're good.
Thank you, Marlon.
Thank you.